Namaste and welcome to Pods by PEI, a policy discussion series brought to you by Policy Entrepreneurs Inc. I am Shriya Rana. In today's episode, we have PEI colleague Ridesh Sapkota in conversation with Laxman Pant on evaluating Nepal's new social media bill and its implication to freedom of expression online. Laxman Pant is the chairperson of Media Action Nepal and elected co-chair of the Media Freedom Coalition Consultative Network. He is also an adjunct professor of media ethics and journalism at the Tbilisi State University and the University of Georgia. He currently serves as the country representative for the AMIC. Ridesh and Laxman delve into analyzing the bill's provisions and how they may conflict with the constitutional rights to free speech. They also explore how Nepal can better foster digital spaces as forum for civic expressions and debate. We hope you enjoyed the conversation.
Namaste, my name is Ridesh Sapkota.
Namaste, my name is Laxman Pant.
So welcome to Pods by PI, Laxman. We're glad to have you here to have this discussion on very important issue.
Thank you, Ridesh. It's a great honor for me to join your podcast.
Thank you. So today we want to delve into the recent social media bill of Nepal 2080, exploring its implications for freedom of speech, user accountability, and government surveillance. So to start with our conversation, I would like to start with understanding the freedom of speech in context of Nepal. So Laxman, since you are working professional in the space and you have been advocating for freedom of speech and free media, how has the concept of free media and freedom of speech has been approached by the state in Nepal, historically and presently?
So thank you. Let me go back to political systems that prevail across the world, including Nepal. We live in a democracy, and there are fundamentally many political systems across the world, mainly authoritarian regime. We also passed by that regime in past. Sometimes kings ruled over this country. There was a constitutional monarchy and multi-party democracy system that we observed many years before we entered to the present political system, which is known as Federal Democratic Republic. Maybe 15, 17 years ago, we realized that. Also, there are systems that are fundamentally authoritarian in reality, but sometimes countries are ruled by absolute sort of communism. So we are in a democracy, and in democracy, freedom of speech is something authorities need to advocate for. And even if there are problems with the regulatory frameworks, they need to promote it. But since this context of this discussion goes back to how freedom of speech is protected online, also in the media platforms. So our constitution as such guarantees right to freedom of speech through Article 17. Several clauses there, mainly 4A. And also for media people, we have very dedicated constitutional provision, the fundamental rights provision, Article 19, that is right to communication. Also, for the protection of personal interest, particularly privacy, we have right to privacy in Article 28. And Article 27 that advocates for right to information. And not only we have fundamental rights provisions that are progressive enough compared to other countries in South Asia, not only in South Asia but across the world. Sometimes international community gives reference to our constitutional and legislative reform process when it comes to freedom of speech. Nepal is as such a state party to several international human rights treaties. I would particularly like to remind treaty that is ICCPR, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, that Nepal has already ratified. Its Article 19 advocates for right to freedom of expression again. So giving these all context presents Nepal at a place that authorities, the democratic authorities in Nepal, should advocate for right to freedom of speech. So principally, constitutionally, our right to freedom of expression are guaranteed by the Constitution of Nepal, also international treaties. As such, we are enjoying as well. If you compare any civic thought coming in front, either by journalistic media outlets, radio, TV, newspaper, or through online space, including this podcast. So when these opinions come in front of people, we see there is now emerging trend, the emerging political parties are coming into force. So the traditionally established political parties sometimes have some sort of very rigid, I would like to say, authoritarian thought in their mind, despite being democratic. So these are all discussions. It's not only limited to the social media bill, in short it is known as. It is actually a bill to regulate any conversation in social media platforms. Before that, we have seen there were some directives issued by the Ministry of Information and Communication Technology. Mm-hmm. So these all things, when you like my thoughts, it is okay for authority to go ahead. When you don't like, when you have criticism about what I write or express through easily, readily available media platforms, then authorities go on introducing sort of laws. Yes. So that is the main problem.
Yeah. So Laxman, since that you have mentioned about social media bill, now I would like to move on to the segment where we evaluate the social media bill that was recently announced. So to begin with, what is the social media regulating bill? And could you please give a brief summary of this bill and why is it important?
Regulation of media is required. Regulation is accepted. There are some theories, for example, censorship. As long as government or authorities are not motivated by the principle of controlling independent voice or civic space, it's fine for authorities going with introducing any bill or coming up with any laws, but that must be legitimate. That must come through legitimate way, because Nepal, again, has ratified international treaties. For example, ICCPR, Article 19, there is 3-part test provision. If authorities want to have some law, that must be required, and that must be legitimate, and that is helpful for the health of democracy. So this social media bill that was introduced last November, and the context goes back even that when the Ministry of Information and Communication Technology actually introduced a social media directive, resulting to ban over social media platform known as TikTok. Yeah. So then now there is social media bill. This is principally vague social media bill. There is no principally guaranteed thing of the constitutional provision. It actually goes against right to freedom of expression spirit under Article 17 of the Constitution of Nepal. Because the right to freedom of expression that are guaranteed offline are also guaranteed online. Recently, the Human Rights Council of the United Nations stated that rights that we enjoy offline in Mandala or in the street elsewhere to show our sometimes frustration or appreciation to anything, that should be enjoyed online as well. Article 19 of our Constitution guarantees rights for journalists, online news portals as well. So this social media bill is actually not grounded into a very clear principle. That is one thing. And the most critical part of this social media bill is that it lacks adequate, appropriate consultations. It has not reached out to the people who could share with their insights to this bill. So there are personal data issues. It is very closely linked to some critical issues, for example, preventing disinformation or a hate speech.
I'd like to stop you there because my next question addresses that, Laxman. So before we evaluate this bill for its impact, can we evaluate it as a piece of policy? Even at first glance, the bill lacks elements that make it a robust policy tool. Can you go over some of them?
Media policy reform issue is a long discussed issue here in Nepal. If you remember, we have been long talking about coming up with an umbrella act regulating all media platforms, including that of the social media platforms. The problem is that people often do not understand the difference between journalistic media outlets and the social media platforms. Social media platforms can be accessed by anyone these days. For demonstrations, people used to go back to the street Now social media outlets are very easily and readily available to people. So they are accessing this. The policy reform issues is a very serious issue because we do have 7 provincial assemblies at this moment and this federal parliament. And lawmakers are actually not into what Nepal has committed to international communities through becoming signatory to several international human rights treaties. So as a policy reform issue, the reflection of Nepal's own constitutional provision should come into that. If you are principally grounded in something, you will have less criticism of that thing. So that is one thing lacking. Second, a lot of policies are coming into public discussions because they lack serious sort of engagement from the experts. And third one is these policies are introduced. I remember many of provincial assemblies in Nepal, including Gandaki and Sudapashchim, they went through some sort of media-related bills, but later on they had to go back with their own decisions on that. So I would say they are very less educated for those who are into policy-making levels. So that is seriously lacking.
So all of these problems can lead to misuse of the bill. But even beyond that, there are functional problems. There is a provision for content moderation mentioned on the bill, where platform operators are obliged to remove content flagged by the management centers or related agencies. How do you think this will impact the operation of social media platforms and the kind of content available to Nepali users?
If social media platforms are independent enough to do that, taking care in mind the individual rights to freedom of speech, that is fine. But we have seen, let's talk about big data companies, for example, Meta. They come to Nepal, they wanted to have collaboration with Election Commission of Nepal. We're very sort of suspicious about the work of big data companies as well. The data that preserve with them, because this bill is providing a sort of right to the social media platforms to have their own privacy policy. That means your data could be either protected if you are trusting them. If you don't trust, then with the direction of authorities, they could at point of time provide that data to anyone else. So this is something against the spirit of our own fundamental rights provisions that ensure or guarantees right to freedom of speech here in Nepal. Also, content filtration or moderation kind of things. This is something platforms do very less in the request of individuals, not harming any subsisting relationship or jeopardizing that relationship, but mostly that they do in the direction of authorities to protect their businesses. So this collides, and this is actually contrary to how we try to practice freedom of speech online.
So following up on that, how do you see this playing out as someone who has advocated for freedom of speech? Could you elaborate on the bill's specific provisions that have raised concern about freedom of speech and expression?
The one important thing is it will create a very fearful society, mostly on part of those who are critical to any wrongdoings of authorities and power centers. For example, let's connect this bill to the works of journalists, for example. There is the provision is that online, at point this says that any false or misinformation, and that takes the context of news stories as well. And they are not aware about Nepal's constitution providing or ensuring the right to freedom of press. So this would very directly impact the work of journalists who share their content online through news media outlets, also through social media platform, because this is the age of convergence. So everyone tried to reach out to large number of people, and for that they are using social media platform. This will have very direct intervening consequences to the lives of independent journalists who dare to question authority. That is one thing. Second thing, the personal data, as I mentioned, as platform are assigned or platform has right to introduce their own privacy policy, your correspondence with me or your issues related to your property and everything. And the intention, there is dual or multiple punishment procedures there. We do have some existing laws in place that talks about electronic transaction. For example, ETA, Electronic Transaction Act, which supposed to be replaced by information technology bill, ministry often goes on that they are in the process, but it never comes out. That also has very critical aspect for freedom of speech. That is another thing. We do have civil code. We do have some laws relating to, for example, if someone engages in caste-based discrimination or gender-based discrimination through online sharing kind of things. So there is dual or multiple provision of punishment, and that actually contradict with the existing laws as well. That is another impact. The third important impact is civic today, or citizens, you and me, go to social media platforms to have our say. Okay, so there will always be fear among people who want to criticize the wrongdoings of authorities, of any power center, of any, say, for example, corruption sort of things. So this will have very negative impact to thriving democracy. If you are not allowed to criticize, and if you are not allowed to have your say in platforms, for example, social media platforms or in the media, then it will be a very direct threat to democracy as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very interesting insight, Laxman. So now that we have mentioned about the user accountability side, I also want to touch up on the challenges in enforcing these provisions to the social media platforms. So the bill relies on accountability on social media platforms. For instance, the bill requires networks with over 1 lakh users to foresee and impose fine for non-compliance. So what challenges do you foresee in enforcing these provisions, especially for smaller social media platforms?
Yeah. You can't go back to all users as a platform. You can track record or keep record of the all users, their history, their education, their sex, their gender, their identity, because it's right to be anonymous online is actually guaranteed under Article 19 of the ICCPR. Because for security reasons, there is also a whistleblower sort of provision within international human rights laws. You don't want to disclose your identity for the sake of your own security. So we are in democracy. We can't compare our way of communicating to people and providing pretext of you sharing some sort of disinformation, giving examples of countries that actually, in the beginning I said, have authoritarian political system. So yes, user accountability is very important, but we should not forget the fact that Nepal's authorities have not spent even a single penny for education, for digital literacy. There is no digital literacy courses at the school level, at university level, among youngsters. Our universities or our authorities or ministries teaching youngsters about these evolving issues. So if you go on imposing sort of restrictions on freedom of speech or someone's critical thoughts, that would also be detrimental to your own activities. So rather, asking platforms sometimes could be serving authorities' interest, not sometimes, mostly. But you can't take or you can't keep record of all individuals that are using your platforms. So in a long-term sustainable way, if authorities are really or government is really sensitive about user accountability, they should invest upon sort of educative, informative programs, possibly in the universities and schools.
Yeah. Also, can you add on to the regulating body or the regulating body that the bill proposes, also the arrangement of that body being political? Can you add on that?
If you look into the media councils, the social media bill, it has some arrangement about council, and that council is led by minister with secretary on board. Then, there is one regulatory body that we call NTA, okay, the Telecommunication Authority. But Telecommunication Authority, we see, often fails to provide policy suggestions to the ministry as well. There are some regulatory frameworks as such about appointing the people. Appointment of people should be independent. You can have your representative on part of the ministry, on part of authorities. But if you are controlling that council or if you are controlling that regulatory mechanism with the ideology or with the idea that you actually want to control things, this has a very predominant consequence to the issue of pre-censorship. Nepal's constitution or our fundamental rights don't talk about pre-censorship. There, at point, there is one clause somewhere in this social media bill that authorities could look into your intentions. How can you check my intention? And can you check my intention looking into my face? Unless you are a psychologist, okay? You can't check it. And if you see some fear of expression and you don't want to come that idea out, that is called pre-censorship. So principally, this bill is in sort of pre-censorship issues as well. So I think if they really want to have good intention of this bill, really want to educate people about the appropriate use of social media platforms and internet kind of things, I think the formation of a regulatory mechanism actually who needs to lead this, that must be very fair, independent, have some expertise on the not only on the use of the technology as such, but also its far-reaching impact to the lives of people who dare to comment on social media or create sort of criticism.
Yeah, so those are great observations, Laxman. But let's take a moment to understand the flip side of this issue. The proponents claim that the bill helps prevent the spread of disinformation. They focus on the sensitive issues of elections and call for an end to false information, propaganda on the social media. The social media space also recently nurtured populist politics in Nepal. Additionally, with the rise of AI deepfakes, that makes it hard to tell what's real. So I think this adds nuances to our approach towards media regulation. What is your take on this?
For media content to regulate, we have a regulatory body called Press Council Nepal when it comes to the pretext of something, for example, COVID-19, sometimes disaster, earthquake, sometimes elections, as you are mentioning. These are pretext for governments. These are pretext for authorities, and they often go on saying that this year only, globally, in 2024, 81 countries are having their national elections, including the largest democracy in India and US as well. So disinformation is of concern to everyone, not only to the people like us who are seeking broader civic space to have their say, the public say in these platforms, but also to authorities as well. So what we see is disinformation actually, it relates its roots to ethics, ethical standards. So if we go on educating people, if there are some sort of guidelines, and if authorities come to a conclusion that these guidelines can be shared among internet users or social media platform users, then automatically there will be less disinformation or misleading informations. But unfortunately in Nepal, the idea of disinformation is used in a pretext of the examples that I am mentioning. People wanted to control sort of disinformation related to COVID-19. And that's why authorities started saying about this. The idea of fake news actually, though it has a scholarly interpretation back to 70s or 80s, it was most popularized during the 2016 US president elections by Donald Trump. So that idea exists here, and I have seen personally in the Southeast Asian countries, for example, in Thailand and Myanmar and Brunei, or in some contexts Philippines, governments attempted to come up with anti-disinformation laws. That is somehow, I have heard authorities here in public programs saying that we should also work out on coming up with some anti-disinformation laws. What is disinformation? You don't like some interpretation or data, that could be disinformation for you. But at point, there are regulatory organizations. Let universities and institutions like Press Council look into these issues, educating people that this is do's and don'ts. You can't do that. So at part, I forgot to remind you that this social media bill is sort of a moral policing. They're talking more about ethical standards, do's and don'ts, but coming up in a form that they're going to punish it.
Yeah. So to add on to your response, I think Nepal has recently been on track to bringing out prohibitive and protective bills instead of finding nuanced solutions to social changes. So to summarize, the problem is not with social media regulations alone, but the general blanket approach in this particular bill.
If you remember why TikTok was banned months ago, the reason was there was no substance though. The reason authorities were telling that this platform in particular is a problem to social harmony. And there is no clear-cut substance about how social harmony could be measured. So in relations to that, there are many other platforms as well. So when you are coming or going through sort of more specific bills to prevent what you referring to disinformation or misinformation or misleading news, that would also be detrimental to the health of democracy. So instead of coming up with a lot of regulatory frameworks and I would rather say control mechanisms, I think this is right time to go back to our own existing laws. For example, Electronic Transaction Act has remained a very detrimental or negative impact sort of instrument for journalists to play their active role on watching upon the wrongdoings. I was looking into a case of two journalists being arrested in Kanchanpur district 5-6 days ago. Now, they were released last night. And we're looking into these cases. And they were sharing something in Facebook. They were not writing news, something in Facebook about police, about authorities. And they were arrested with Clause 47 of the Electronic Transaction Act, then court order. Then they were released yesterday on some personal guarantee. But they should appear before police if there is further clarification needed. This is not the first time that police has been using Electronic Transaction Act's Clause 47. Actually, they are misusing this clause to arrest or go against independent critical voice on social media. So instead of coming up with a lot of specific regulatory mechanisms, I think we need to look back to on existing regulatory frameworks, whether they are detrimental or they have contributed positively to create awareness among people for the appropriate and safe use of internet.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, the introduction of the social media bill will in turn do more harm to the same issues rather than to prevent or
Exactly.
encourage the freedom of expression in the digital sphere. So moving forward, Laxman, so if that's the case, what problems do you think need to be prioritized by such a bill, and how can state approach this better?
The most important thing is that policymakers, whoever, either this bill or act coming through appropriate legislative reform issues through parliament, or sometimes because bills are originally generated in the concerned ministries, and they must be very much careful about our fundamental rights provisions. They should not go against that spirit, including that of our commitment to international community. That is one thing. Second, we should not go on comparing our context to countries like Afghanistan or Somalia or Iran or some context. You may be aware that in last 5-6 years, India has shut down internet for more than 700 times. It's the largest democracy, but when we go on giving examples of countries, I think we don't need to compare our things with countries who have actually been detrimental to independent critical voice. So that is another thing. Third, yes, regulation is needed. That regulatory framework should be guided with the principles of legitimate tools. Let's go back to social media directive in the context of which TikTok was banned. That directive did not come through appropriate channel. And when asked to the authorities, I was joining some conversations with the ministry officials, and they go on saying that, oh, our parliament is not appropriately functioning, and it would take for parliament to operate 6 months, 8 months. If there is that much urgency, you should lobby with parliamentarians to come up with the law, because that must be legitimate, and that must also be required by law. Not only required by law, but also by that is good for the health of democracy. So these are some things I think principally policymakers needs to be very clear and very careful about the foundations of these regulatory frameworks.
Yeah. Speaking of foundation bills that you mentioned. So, shouldn't Nepal focus on creating more robust tech infrastructures and policies first? For example, if you see the digital privacy acts and all these sort of laws, they are still lacking in the front of like places like information security, data security. But we have chosen this very specific corner of the internet, which is social media, and try to regulate it instead of going foundationally on like more basic issues. So, what do you think should Nepal do onto this? And
I think policymakers, again, lawmakers, or Nepal as a state, all component within the state, not only government, should not forget that we do have very specific, unique provisions in the Constitution. The foundation of any specific laws coming in force this discussion should base upon the constitutional provisions. There are very less criticism about the fundamental rights provisions of Nepal's own constitution in the international arena. Also, a lot needs to be invested or discussed about the localization of the international human rights tools, especially that are mentioned within the right to freedom of expression provisions of the ICCPR. So far as right to privacy or right to privacy in digital platform is concerned, our constitution clearly guarantees right to privacy through Article 28. Also, we do have under the Civil Code right to Privacy Protection Act. So these all acts, your right to privacy or your right to freedom of speech elsewhere in offline are also, as I mentioned earlier, citing an interpretation of the Human Rights Council of United Nations, they are also applicable to online platforms. So when we go on introducing a new law or enforcing new law, I think we should not forget the principle that these laws do not exist in vacuum. There is some interrelationship of what throughout the 17 or 18 years plus after the end of monarchy, we have instituted very strong foundations of law reform process.
yes, that's very interesting. So, Laxman, do you think Nepal can do better on this front by focusing on digital capacity building rather than through such a protectionist and prohibitive bill?
It is necessary for digital infrastructure capacity. We have in the recent days seen here in Nepal that there was some disaster in terms of sort of a telecommunication company went out of this country. And also when we talk about the digital infrastructure issues, let's focus on the security issue. Authorities often go on saying that this particular content is creating threat to national security. Are we prepared enough through infrastructure means that some information is actually not creating problem? Okay, the ban over TikTok in some country, for example in India, was a security threat as authorities cited there. Same was the case when Donald Trump during his tenure back wanted to have sort of ban over TikTok, but due to court order they could not do that. So I think a lot needs to be invested in infrastructure issue, but rather than infrastructure capacity of the internet or digital kind of thing, we need to invest much on awareness building. And that awareness building should come through sort of education institutions or regulatory institutions rather than direct government intervention.
Yes, that's very interesting. So, we are almost at the end of this conversation. So, I would like to head to the awareness and the education side of things. So, Nepal is heading rapidly into digitization with government's ambition to become a tech hub. If we look at the accessibility of digital services, almost 70% of the Nepalese people have access to smartphones, which is growing rapidly. Still, there are a lot of things that could be done in the space of data privacy, uses of internet, and so forth. What active role do you think the government should take, especially on the awareness and education front?
We should not take pride of the 70% or 80% access to what we call smartphones and these kind of things. You and I may have multiple social media platforms, or you can be having more than one smartphone with you. That does not guarantee you are safe in terms of your expression online. I think a lot needs to be invested from the roots, that is, again, academic institutions, schools. Also awareness building campaigns needs to be initiated, not alongside the government, but with all stakeholders, reaching out to the people, informing them about the safe use of internet, the second thing. The third very important thing is that why are people using, 70 or 80% of people are using internet? Are they really into things that are actually required? Government may come up with some sort of surveillance. This conversation could be recorded by authorities if they want, when it is public. Or our private conversation in telecommunications could be recorded. Same is the case in internet when it is under the control. So I think when it comes to educating people and in the real sense utilizing the access of people to the smartphone or infrastructure thing in digital space, again, a solid investment is needed. And that starts with educating people. Degrees alone do not guarantee that you are digitally safe. So that is very important for me.
Yes. So we are almost at the end of this conversation. If you have anything to add on to our conversation today, or if you would like to add anything from your side.
Yeah, I represent civil society organizations, leading CSO here, but also working for safety of journalists and civic space globally through my engagement with global network called Media Freedom Coalition Consultative Network. And we have a lot of opportunity for us to engage ourselves in policy discussion issues. At the global level as well, if you have heard, the United Nations is trying to come up with a treaty called Cyber Security Treaty. And there are some reservations on part of the civil society. European Union recently came up with the idea about AI Act, artificial intelligence kind of things. Surface impact is everywhere. Everyone knows. Our grandparents or your parents or my parents, they can have access to internet. There are a lot of scams to their lives. Is government aware about how digitally illiterate people, but having access to these platforms, have been the victim of digital scams? I think government should take more care about these things rather than silencing independent and critical voice in social media platforms. That would be helpful for the health of democracy.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Laxman, for joining us today at Pods by PI. And it was a wonderful, insightful conversation. And thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much to you, Ridesh, and to your team. And I look forward to listening this conversation.
Thanks for listening to Pods by PEI. I hope you enjoyed Ridesh's conversation with Laxman on evaluating Nepal's new social media bill and its implication to freedom of expression online. Today's episode was produced by Khushi Hang with support from Nirjan Rai and Ridesh Sapkota. The episode was recorded at PEI Studio and was edited by Ridesh Sapkota. Our theme music is courtesy of Rohit Shakya from Zindabad. If you liked today's episode, please subscribe to our podcast. Also, please do us a favor by sharing us on social media and leave a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or wherever you listen to the show. For PEI's video-related content, please search for Policy Entrepreneurs on YouTube. To catch the latest from us on Nepal's policy and politics, please follow us on Twitter at tweet2PEI, that's tweet followed by the number 2 and PEI, and on Facebook at Policy Entrepreneurs Inc. You can also visit pei.center to learn more about us. Thanks once again from me, Shreya. We'll see you soon in our next episode.